these activities in different parts of the world. Value chains occur in the many different activities. They can be applied, and they are actually methods of production, methods of organization of production internationally that can apply, for example, to fresh fruit growing and processing and selling. And then it can be interesting to look at how different countries operate different segments of the value chain. So here we have fresh fruit production that, for example, in Jordan and Honduras is essentially centered in the production and eventually packing and cold storage, doesn't go to the process of processing this fruit, which is where Chile already entered, and Chile has been moving from simply producing the inputs and the products for exports to the actual processing and distribution and marketing of these products. Or a product, a well-known product like the Italian Nutella that is produced by a big multinational corporation originally from Italy, Ferrero, the Ferrero Group, which is headquartered in near Turin in northern Italy, that has a variety of different plants in charge of different segments of the chain, from the headquarters in blue to the main international suppliers to different factories where they actually process different segments of the chain, and then sales offices all over the world. So you see that even a simple chocolate and hazelnut spread as Nutella, a very simple product, can be carried out following the logic of a value chain in different parts of the world with a process of functional integration and geographic fragmentation. And of course, in more sophisticated products and services, such as the offshore services, you see that the organization of the value chain can take a different form with specialization of firms in different segments, in different boxes. With what matters is also this big arrow on the left-hand side of the slide, where value added grows from being very low to being very high, depending on the kind of activities and the kind of segments of the activity, with a number of vertical activities that are also industry specific and that represent manufacturing and services that are instrumental to the offshore services value chain. So you see a variety. You can already perceive how different forms of organization can prevail in different value chains and different sectors. And a problem that has emerged a few years ago is the problem of actually measuring the extent of value chains, because a lot of the value added is added by firms, and access to firm level data is often limited by the proprietary nature of information and data, and therefore statistical institutes worldwide are struggling to be able to measure value chains. One remarkable effort has been made by the OECD and also the Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, as well as the UN Statistical Office, are all developing different ways of calculating and measuring value chains. But let me give you an example of how these measures are typically constructed. We are portraying here the value chain of a sneaker, of a running shoe like this, which is produced partly in Mali, in Northern Africa, where Mali produces the shoelaces and contributes with $100 of domestic value added, and exports the shoelaces to Ethiopia, which has a foreign value added, so a value added that is contributed by Mali, and the domestic value added through the local processing in Ethiopian factories that further add an additional 200, so that the value of what is being exported by Ethiopia would be $300, and these would be exported to South Africa, which itself would add an additional $50 in packaging and finishing and then servicing and retail and distribution. So the overall final value of one pair of sneakers exports would be $350. This would be the gross value of exports. But at the same time, you realize that each country has been contributing to the creation of value added to a much smaller extent than 350. And if we were computing the values of exports as gross exports, that is the value of exported goods and services by each country, we would be double counting. We would be considering as if each country would be adding respectively 100 and then 300 and then 350 with a clear double counting, whereas the value added is being sliced across the different countries, where each country and each firm within each country is contributing to a slice. You already realize that the problem behind value chain is who contributes to what share of value, and therefore what the benefits can be out of value chain. But thanks to this approach, several measures of value chains have been proposed. Here I give you a snapshot of what was measured by the UN Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, on GVC participation rates, where they make it clear that GVC participation can take the form of upstream as well as downstream participation. The upstream is the foreign value added used for a country's exports. That is the Mali's exports of shoes from Mali to Ethiopia, which for Ethiopians would be foreign value added, that is value added from a foreign source, to which Ethiopians would add a domestic value added downstream, the value added that they contribute to South African exports. That is the exports from Ethiopia to South Africa, that is itself an input for final goods exports from South Africa. And doing all these calculations for all products of the world and all countries and so on, the UN Conference on Trade and Development came to a big data set called EORA, E-O-R-A, which gives us numbers on the role of value chains. These are percentages of a country's exports. And we see that very large percentages, from a minimum of 35, 37% to a maximum of 66% of gross exports of a country or a region, are accounted by multi-stage manufacturing processes. And you see that the situation is different in different countries. You see that, for example, in the most integrated area in terms of value chains appears to be the European Union. Developed economies tend to take part in value chains to a larger extent than developing countries. And then you see that if for some regions like Central America, for example, there's a lot of upstream components of the value chain, that is intermediate goods being imported as inputs, contributing to exports from Central America and Mexico. A lot of upstream component, whereas a downstream component, that is the contribution that each country would give through inputs of other countries' exports, are larger, for example, in the rest of Latin America, and in transition economies, the formerly socialist economies belonging to the former Soviet Union. You see that the largest part of the value chains are represented by downstream components of the value chain. That is the supply of the raw materials and primary goods to a value chain that is then assembled elsewhere, that is then manages to produce final goods and services in another country, which are then themselves exported. And what is interesting is that overall, we see a different way of calculating, and the same method, but essentially presenting data in a different form. And you see that The value of gross exports, which is made of foreign value added and domestic value added, as explained before, has been growing. Gross exports have been growing over the years, and the orange slice, the orange share of gross exports, that is the value, the foreign value added, which are inputs of a final production that are exported from country to the next country, and then contribute to the exports of this country, has been increasing. So an indication of a remarkable rise of value chains in international trade. Why so much interest in value chains? Why, if you read the literature, the academic literature, or you read newspapers and magazines, and you must have realized how frequently one speaks about GVCs, global value chains. I think that there are several reasons why there's so much interest in value chains. The first one is that they can give countries and firms access to demanding markets and sophisticated markets, the key to new markets. Secondly, through value chains, firms and countries can get access to knowledge, technology, organization, new technologies, the little iPhones or the little cell phones are represented there, and the technology that comes with value chains. And thirdly, in terms of countries and firms belonging and participating in value chains, the participation, the GVC integration can offer opportunities for learning and innovation. And here, the focus of this lecture is central in the role of value chains and innovation. Why do value chains matter? There's one major result that was obtained by several studies. Here I report the regression analysis produced by the most recent World Bank World Development Report that was published in 2020, where you see this regression line going upwards that implies that an increasing GVC participation is positively associated to labor productivity. So firms and countries participating in value chains see their labor productivity increase. The authors did not study causality. There can be a selection biases here. So this could imply that those firms that were already more productive managed to achieve an integration in value chains, or it could be the other way around. In any case, we see that there's a clearly positive and significant association of GVC integration and labor productivity. And we obtained the same result with in a different paper produced with Pierluigi Montalbano and Silvia Nenci, two colleagues of mine in Rome, where in 2018 we managed to show with enterprise level data from the World Bank data set and OECD trading value added data, we managed to obtain the same result for Latin American firms. What we managed to show is that firms integrating in GVCs are more productive, and we also control for causality. So we managed to say that being part of a value chain allows firms to become more productive. It's not the other way around. And then we speculated on the reasons why, and we explore the possibilities that this may be related to larger knowledge exchanges, deeper interactions, learning by supplying. So by supplying to a multinational corporation, local firms learn how to better organize their production process or how to better organize their design or sales activities. And one concept that is very relevant and is often used in the literature is the concept of upgrading, which is often related to the idea of innovation. It's very relevant to our aims at the moment. Can I hide this band here? Let me see. No. Stay here. No. Just a second. Okay. So, and let me introduce this different concept that is often used in value chain discussions, which is the concept of upgrading. Upgrading itself may sound like a generic expression. I mean, something is improving. In international trade theories, upgrading used to imply higher quality products or the capacity to sell products at a higher price without losing market shares. In the case of value chains, upgrading takes a very specific meaning. And if you consider these three bars as three possible value chains, where, say, think of, I don't know, wooden furniture processing, where firm A, this white box A, would be the firm managing the wood and cutting the wood and processing the wood, whereas B would be the firm producing finished furniture, and C would be the retail chain that would be in charge of wholesaling in the country as well as exporting. So three sets of activities all along a value chain, a value adding chain. And then the literature has been writing about upgrading in products and processes that would be happening in each box, where each firm would be improving the quality and variety of the products they produce and improving the processes. So very similar to what innovation in processes and products would be. But there's also a different meaning that is very relevant in this kind of discussion and this kind of literature, which is the functional upgrading. So firms only operating at a level A or A prime that would move into B prime or eventually into B second here to the right hand side. That is, instead of only producing wood, they would start, the wood producing company would start producing furniture as well, and eventually would enter the final wholesale market and eventually become capable of penetrating markets up to reaching the final consumers. So firms may find interesting and relevant and strategic for their activities to move into different functions and choose the function that offers the best opportunities and the best possible rents and benefits. And in some cases, this literature has been writing about another form of upgrading that would be upgrading, the inter-chain upgrading, that is venturing into a different chain. This is something that may occur when firms develop a capacity to operate within a chain, or they manage to integrate the value chain, and thanks to these capabilities, they decide to try to move to another chain, and using the logistics and the capacity developed to operate a chain, they would start operating another chain. I have some examples here and more rigorous definitions where you see that where you see that process and product and functional and channel or GVC upgrading can occur, and they may imply and you see examples from different countries. An example of a functional upgrading is something I'll explain in details in a minute, or a value chain upgrading is something that we observed in a previous paper looking at Taiwan and looking at the Taiwanese experience in producing televisions and television sets, that these same firms, when they saw and realized that the television set markets were becoming sort of commodities and the unit prices would go down, they managed to enter into different segments of the market, and they converted their activities to start producing computer screens. So they managed to use a similar technology and restructure and reorganize their production using the same capacities to manage a value chain and to manage the hundreds of contracts and relationships with other firms and other suppliers to enter a different chain, the value chain of computer screens. And they've been tremendously successful in doing this. Let me deepen a little bit the discussion on functional upgrading, which is a terminology developed by this literature. And I will do this by presenting an example, a case study from Mexico, from a specific city in northern Mexico, which is called Torreon, which is in Mexico is known as the Mexico-US blue jeans value chain, famous for the quantity and variety of blue jeans companies and blue jeans productions carried out in that city. And then you see a sequence of activities, the value chain that was being made of a number of different activities, from textiles to producing accessories and etiquettes, or the cutting or the assembling or the washing and finishing or the distribution, marketing and retail. And you may think that each of these yellow cells could be made by different firms. So in each cell there would be at least one firm, and 2, 4, 8 firms would make the value chain. Until 1993, essentially the business consisted of a process of production carried out in United States. The light blue cells are those carried out in the United States by large North American firms that would produce the textiles, that would cut the textiles, the cloth into the different pieces, and would then export the parts and the pieces to Mexico, where they would be sewn together by typically women in small companies in northern Mexico, in Torreon. And these ladies, these firms would then export the unfinished product that would then be washed, finished, and distributed, sold, marketed in the US market. So the Mexican share of the value chain would be very small, would only amount to this dark blue cell. Then in 1990 through 1993, a famous trade agreement that was then called NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, that aimed at creating an integrated market between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, was signed by the three governments, and this made it easier to trade back and forth different components and different parts of the blue jeans, so that gradually local firms in Mexico managed to develop capacities to enter into these segments that were previously only produced by North American firms. So the textiles and etiquettes and assembly, as well as washing and finishing, were gradually carried out in Mexico as well. So Mexican firms were created, or new or old firms acquired the capability to enter into these segments and functionally integrated. So they actually upgraded into specific functions beyond the initial function in which they used to be specialized. There was the assembly. And thanks to the development of local capabilities and local institutions and typically a collaborative attitude among local firms and local institutions, and the ease with which international trade could occur between the US and Mexico, and the improving logistics between these two countries, you see that the value chain was increasingly represented by Mexican firms operating in all these dark blue cells and capturing much more value than they used to do at the beginning of this process. So in the language of value chains, we would say that a process of functional upgrading has been occurring in Mexico with firms from Torreon entering different segments of the chain and gradually developing the capacity to produce and enter into different functions of the value chain. Why did they do so? They did so because they were aiming at capturing more value. They were aiming at getting into segments that would offer larger advantages, not only the advantages related to the poorly paid women sewing pieces imported and then re-exporting the assembled unfinished blue jeans, but actually gaining capacities to enter into all these segments and adding value that would stay in the city or in the country. And that brings us to this famous smiley face or smile curve that was proposed by a famous businessman, Mr. Stan Xin, on Taiwan and China and the relationship between Taiwan and China. Stan Xin is probably unknown to most of us and most of you, but he's a very famous businessman because he was the founder of Acer Computers, which is today one of the largest computer producing companies in the world. A company that did not exist 25 years ago, and now it turned into a giant in hardware processing. And he, on a piece of paper, he was asked to draw the strategy of his company, and he said that computer processing is essentially a process whereby the value is added over time, and value is very high in the initial phases where there's a process of innovation and defining new products and new processes and carrying out research and development and designing the nature of the computer and the different components and intermediate goods contained in a computer. And towards the end of the process, where the brand would command a higher price, or marketing and logistics would allow firms to get access to larger shares of value chains. Whereas the segments of production the segments of the value chain that are more related to manufacturing and assembly tend to be those segments that add the least value to this process of value chain, value creation along a chain. So the strategy of a firm, in his mind, would be to try to locate its activities where value added is larger. So in the innovation, the initial phase, or towards the final phase, when the branding and marketing are especially important. And of course, you realize that behind this U curve, there is also a very strong, a very fierce struggle for getting access to the most rewarding and the highest value added segments. And of course, companies operating in the most valuable segments of the chain will resist and will deny access to new firms and new competitors. So whereas these will be investing and trying to get access to this is very easy to understand whenever we talk about a brand. You know, brands are sometimes so valuable that anybody willing to enter and conquer a segment of market that has been dominated by a brand would find it very hard to penetrate this market, because branding often commands large shares of the value added in any product or any service. And And indeed, this process of a U curve has been changing over time. If you take a historical perspective and you think of how value added or profitability has been changing depending on the specific segments of the chain, from the research and development, design to the after sales and marketing, you see that the value chains in the industrial revolution area would be an inverted U, with the segments of the chain offering the largest value-added shares in the manufacturing and assembly phases of the chain, whereas with the value chain explosion since the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the value chain turned upside down and actually became a U curve, with the most valuable segments to the left and to the right-hand side of the curve. And perhaps in the knowledge economy and the ICT revolution and the digital economy that we're living today, this process is even more pronounced, with fewer and smaller shares of value added in the manufacturing phases, and more in the pre-competitive research, development, design, and the selling and the marketing and the after-sale services that command very large shares of the value added. Is this true? Is this confirmed by empirical data? Is this something beyond the individual feeling and perception of a successful businessman? A number of studies have been proposed. This one is perhaps the first one of this kind, by Runge and Del Prete in 2018 in Economics Letters, where they managed to show that this U-curve story is empirically grounded. They actually used a big data set, the Orbis data set on European companies. They managed to get access to data on over 2 million companies. They managed to split companies' activities and slice their activities according to different functions along the value chain, from the pre-services, primary goods, intermediates, final goods, and post-services. And they managed to calculate the value added of each of these segments. And you see that the segments offering the largest value added are those at the beginning and at the end of the process. So if you only look at the red lines, you see that these bars suggest that the U curve is confirmed with larger levels of value added in the initial and final phases of the value chain. And they propose a number of estimates and a number of regressions to show that this U curve is confirmed using different econometric techniques, essentially confirming that the process of organizing production and the value, the creation of value added follows a U curve, with the highest shares of the value added at the beginning and at the end of the curve. This is very relevant because, of course, this might have an impact on the strategy of individual firms, all struggling to enter the largest value added promising segments of the chain, as well as for countries that would like to have more and more companies operating in the most profitable and the most rent and value-added intensive segments of the chain. And if I were to make a first summary of this kind of literature, I would say that by the way, it's a literature that's been expanding exponentially over the last 2 decades. I would say that the GVC literature is emphasizing how non-production activities are more and more important. Marketing, design, sale, they are essential for the creation of value added. And think of how many companies are selling the result of intangible assets. Think of the new digital companies, the digital platforms, the Amazon or Google or these kind of companies that essentially make money and add value, which is not related to production activities, but to the design, the selling, the data processing, and the innovation in defining new products and new market niches, and using the non-tangible assets they are well equipped with. The second major result and major focus of this literature is related to the growing importance of global buyers. These large companies, think of the large supermarket chains that we know in the West, the Walmart in the US, or the Carrefour in most European countries, as well as overseas countries, that have a very large role in influencing the governance, the organization of value chain, and the distribution of value worldwide. These are new animals that started growing in the early 90s, and after 30 years managed to become tremendously powerful and influential in affecting the prospects of manufacturing firms worldwide. A third element that this literature has been focusing on is the role of external linkages as key channels of knowledge for firms and for developing countries firms. So getting access to knowledge is important for any firm. Nowadays, this form of organization is offering remarkable access to knowledge. This does not mean that knowledge is always and easily accessible. This does not mean that these possible advantages offered by larger access to knowledge are easy to grasp. On the other hand, there's a lot of research showing that an active attitude of developing capabilities and struggling to get access to this knowledge is important, but still, these channels of knowledge exist, and they did not exist in the past. And fourthly, the nature of the relationships within a value chain is very important for the implications that the value chain can have on upgrading, learning, innovation, the value added and the benefits accruing to local firms and local suppliers. And notions such as governance, the explicit consideration of power, and the asymmetry of power prevailing in value chain has also been emphasized by this kind of literature. Let me see how much time we have. I think I can briefly, if you can bear with me another 5 minutes, we conclude this big part, then open the floor for comments or questions, and then take a little break. And I will try to give you a feeling of another area that is very important to understand whenever we talk about value chains. And the area is really, the area I'm referring to is the area of governance. Governance is a specific term that in this context, in the value chain context, is used as a synonym for coordination, for organization of the value chain. And different modes of governance have been studied in the literature. In some cases, governance has been seen as driving the organization of the chain, organizing activities and pushing and pulling and organizing the chain. And others have been emphasizing the role of governance as a linking process or a mechanism to link different actors and different actors and agencies, and therefore governance would be the capacity to organize and link different actors. And finally, a newer trend of research has been discussing governance as a way to normalize activities. And this is very related to the process of certification and to the process of standard settings and to the process of quality certification and design and enforcement. The theoretical explanations behind the different forms of governance prevailing in different value chains are very related to the well-known theory of Olivier Williamson, an economist, a North American economist that has been writing about transaction cost economics, and has been mentioning how in many instances transactions are costly. There's a lot of information that needs to be exchanged with transactions, and therefore whenever transactions are too costly, then it's too costly to rely on the market, and therefore firms will tend to organize their activities along a process of vertical integration. So integrating internally to a firm a number of contracts, a number of relationships that otherwise, if the markets were working efficiently, would be delegated to the market. And Humphrey and Smith further elaborate the Williamson theory, and they add an additional layer of complexity, writing about networks, which are intermediate solutions, intermediate forms of governance between the two extremes, the hierarchy and the pure market, and networks of different kind with more or less presence, larger or lower presence of hierarchy in the relationships among firms. And following this approach, there's a remarkable paper produced in 2005 by this group of scholars, Gary Gareffi, John Humphrey, and Tim Sturgeon. That is perhaps one of the most quoted paper in this literature, that discusses when and why different forms of governance prevail in different circumstances. And they essentially relate the existence of different forms of governance to three factors. First of all, complexity of information to carry out transactions, how difficult, how complex it is to carry out a transaction. Secondly, the possibility to codify information. You studied the economics of innovation, you know how important tacit and codifiable knowledge is, and how it is important whenever information and knowledge can be codified. And thirdly, different forms of governance would prevail depending on different levels of capabilities and the suppliers' capabilities in the chain. And they came to define 5 different modes of governance. Look at the first column on the left-hand side, where the two extremes would be the market mode of governance, so fully relying on market-based transactions, or the opposite, it would be a fully hierarchical, so the vertically integrated firm, where any transaction occurs within the boundary of the firm. And then additional intermediate forms of governance that would prevail depending on the level of complexity of transactions, the possibility to codify transactions, and the capabilities of suppliers involved in this value chain. Let me try to go over this table very quickly. Whenever transactions are of little complexity, then the possibility to codify transactions and the capability of suppliers are high, and the market would tend to prevail. But whenever transactions are complex to carry out, then you see that there's a variety of different options that could prevail. And if the complexity is high, but the possibility of codifying transactions, so exchanging and carrying out transactions in a form that can be totally codified, whenever this is high and whenever suppliers' capabilities are high, then a modular form of governance would prevail. and on, in the case of a low possibility of codifying transactions with suppliers' capabilities, a relational, that is a form of governance that would imply several meetings and interactions, and person-to-person interaction would then to prevail. And finally, the captive, whenever suppliers' capabilities are very low. So the lead firm, the leaders, the firm defining the governance of the value chain would end up prevailing a captive form that is carefully monitoring suppliers, eventually providing them with technical assistance and making sure that they actually comply with the specific requirements imposed by the lead firm leading the value chain. And they graphically represent the different forms of governance with this diagram, where you see the market, which is which would prevail whenever transactions can occur with very little costs, or a modular, where production can be carried out and can be split in different modules, and the lead firm would interact with turnkey suppliers, which themselves would interact with the components and material suppliers. Relational, where there's a two-way change of knowledge and information, or a captive, where the lead firm would be heavily controlling and monitoring a supplier's captive that are typically exclusive suppliers of the lead firm, and therefore exercising a sort of a captive form of governance over their suppliers. And you see that the degree of explicit coordination and power asymmetry is especially strong and especially high on the right-hand side, whereas here on the left-hand side, in the market form of governance, the asymmetry of power is very limited. We have several customers and suppliers. The degree of explicit coordination is achieved through the market mechanism. So there's no entity in charge of ensuring coordination, but the institution called market. And examples of in which sectors these different forms of governance would likely prevail are, you see bicycles, electronics, and cars in the modular value chain, with different modules of a car can be produced in different countries according to customer specifications. Codifiability, so the specific technical component of each intermediate good can be defined as a set of rules, a set of numbers, and a number of algorithms would define exactly what the light of the bulb or the processor for an electric car needs to be. Whereas in a relational value chain, the complexity of transactions is very high. Suppliers can have a good level of capabilities, but the technological content of the transactions cannot be easily codified, and therefore a relational value chain tends to prevail with frequent interactions and contacts, and this typically happens in sectors such as garments, for example, or shoes, or similar kinds of goods, similar kinds of sectors. Why am I expanding on this concept of governance? Because not only governance is a relevant and central concept in this kind of literature, but also because it has been shown. We some years ago we published a book with several colleagues with Harvard University Press called "Upgrading to Compete: Global Value Chains, Clusters, and Small Enterprises in Latin America," where we managed to show that the mode of governance is very relevant to influence local enterprises upgrading and innovation. So the mode of governance prevailing in the chain is relevant and needs to be studied and needs to be understood to understand the implications that this have on local firms' innovation and upgrading. And of course, I won't say more than a sentence on this, but there's an additional element in this kind of reasoning that is, you may have noticed how all this discussion on upgrading is intrinsically related to the existence of rents, the struggle that firms are in to generate, to appropriate, to protect the rents that are generated in a production and a value-adding process. And there are different kinds of rents, and essentially the idea of a U-curve, or the idea of a curve representing different shares of value added, reflects the idea that different levels of rents prevail in different functions within the same value chain, and therefore firms and countries will struggle to get access to these functions and conquer and retain rents as much as possible. I think that I could stop here for the moment. I wonder whether there's a question now, or whether we want to take a break and then continue later. Let me see your faces. I would pause share. I would stop share here. And let me see where you are. You know, it's a bit of speaking in the vacuum that is a bit annoying sometimes, but I see lots of interesting faces. I don't know whether you have questions or remarks, whether you agree, whether you're against what I'm proposing, or whether you want some clarification on something.
Yeah, there is actually a question in the chat from Alexandro.
Please. Is anyone willing to ask a question?
Yes, Alexandra
Where is?
put her question in the chat. She said, hello, I have a question. Is it possible to use added value to increase the competitiveness of domestic goods?
Yes, where is Alexandra? I'm looking for your face there. You know, these are two different concepts, if you wish. So value chains emphasize the idea that firms and countries specialize in segments of activity, in niches of the value chain. So doesn't matter anymore to be a car producer. You need to go beyond that. You need to understand that a car is made of 100 or 1,000 different components and different intermediate goods, and therefore each producer would need to be competitive, and here the word competitive comes in producing a specific segment of the chain. So the idea of competitiveness is related to really being a more efficient producer. The idea of competitiveness, in my mind, applies to the firm level, not so much to the country level. The country level is, you know, countries can have different conditions for competitiveness, but those that actually are or not competitive are firms. And firms typically aim at being competitive, and the value chain approach would suggest that they can be competitive, or they try to be competitive, targeting specific niches, specific segments of the chain. I don't know if I answered, but that's my take, my approach. Did you already read anything about value chains already? Is this totally new or totally familiar to you?
We have a group that has this topic as a task for today. So they read anything that was related to you and to this topic. And about the rest of the group, no, we haven't. So it is new for us. Thanks.
And this group had to produce an assignment or something?
Yes, they have to make a report and present it later.
Ah, okay. All right. So I don't know if you don't have more questions, we can take a short break and resume in 15 minutes.
Actually, I have one question.
Please.
So, okay, does the way in which a country participates in a global value chain matter for labor productivity, according to your research? I mean, for example, have you investigated the assumption that a country that exports raw materials has lower labor productivity than a country that exports something like final products, maybe equipment?
I did not study this aspect myself, but I would argue that, well, first of all, the natural resource intensive sectors are typically, in many instances, they tend to be sectors with high productivity. Especially the mining and extractive industry is heavily capital intensive. And thanks to these capital investments and the little employment that generate, they tend to be highly labor productive. But what I would say is that depending on, I mean, this value chain approach tends to be very sector specific. So it is, and value chains tend to differ depending on sectors. So it is important to take into account the sectoral specificities. And in this regard, countries can target different niches within different value chains and different sectors, and that would make a difference. So it's hard to answer at a very general level because it really depends on the opportunities available for specific sectors and specific niches.
Okay, I see your point. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we should we might have a break and then go back to questions.
Okay. All right. So we stop for 15 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. See you in a while.
Thank you.